Hello and welcome to the Occult Book Review. Today's book is Enochian Vision Magic, an introduction and practical guide to the magic of Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelley by Lon Milo DuQuette. Now, I did mention this book before, and after I mentioned it as being just a practical guide, I was in conversation with some people over the course of the months after it, and they were saying how much it helped them and how it's more than a practical guide, and perhaps I was a bit unfair. So I'm going to put aside the book that I was supposed to review, and I'm going to go back to this one simply because I want to rectify that. And I also think that like not having reviewed a Lon Milo DuQuette book, I should do so. So thankfully for someone like me, DuQuette says that he writes to explain things to himself. Now, if you've looked at Enochian magic and the various tables and the angelic calls and so on, you'll see that it's a very alphanumeric system. And so my own thinking doesn't, I'm not attracted to that. In fact, I'm kind of, it's something that I kind of feel myself pushed away from. I'm not good in that way. But DuQuette makes it quite simple to understand, and then you can decide if you want to go a lot further. Now, it is worth saying that magic rules tend to be defined by the cultural paradigm that's in place at the time. This comes up quite a lot, especially because DuQuette talks about how the Golden Dawn took a lot of liberties with Enochian magic, and perhaps some of those liberties are off-putting to people. But when he goes into what actually occurred and how Dee and Kelley received the system and how they applied magic to themselves, you'll see that there's a lot more scope to bring your own perspective to this system. A lot of the recent conversation I've been hearing about magic and ceremonial magic in particular has been focused upon the exactness of the ceremony, and I've been listening to a lot of Dr. Stephen Skinner's interviews recently, and they're very interesting. It's an area of magic that I don't participate in myself, but I noticed that, say for example, Dr. Stephen Skinner will talk about using implements and doing things exactly right, whereas DuQuette seems to, according to him, he gets very good results, but he's much more creative, shall we say, in terms of how he applies rules to himself. One perfect example would be Dee and Kelley get instructions to make a ring and a tablet and so on. And DuQuette says if you can't get a particular kind of ring, you can make one out of paper and it will do fine. Now, to me, that seems totally at odds with a lot of the ceremonial rules, because they wouldn't say if you can't get a sword made out of a certain kind of steel that was forged when there was an astrological sign in a certain place, that it doesn't matter, you can just get a stick and it will do just as good. But perhaps as someone who advocates very much about the inner workings of magic being more important than the outer rules and regulations, it's no surprise that DuQuette would say something like that. But I know a lot of people would have problems with that particular way of thinking. So ultimately, what you're going to get here is a book that describes the Enochian idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm, and how the angels gave Dee and Kelley a system in which they could break down this microcosm into sections and discover the rulers of each section, and as such, by affecting this microcosm, they were able to get in touch with the heaven of the macrocosm. I'm sure I don't have to go into a description about who John Dee was, so I'll skip that for now. But I think it's important to describe just what his magical techniques were, because if you think about Dee today, you probably have this impression of his ceremonial magic being somewhat similar to the Golden Dawn stereotypical images that we see of their altars and their rooms and so on. But it wasn't like that at all for Dee. So he would bathe before he would conduct his ceremonies. He would have his isolated room. But apart from that, it was mostly a case of praying. So Dee didn't invoke, he didn't kind of have banishing rituals or anything like that. He didn't go onto Kabbalistic trees. He didn't kind of make pentagrams, use knocking, anything like that. It was all about praying. And as DuQuette says quite humorously in the book, he would confess his unworthiness to enter divine presence and at the same time boast of his absolute right to do so. So as you can tell by that kind of line, the book is very conversational, and that's what makes it very accessible to someone like me, because Dee had a very analytical mind. He himself wasn't good at scrying, which is why he employed Edward Kelley to do so. Now, famously, as I'm sure everyone watching this will know, Kelley would use either a crystal ball or a black obsidian mirror, and white light would appear from the whatever he was using and go into his head, and this is kind of the beginning of the magical ritual or communication, if you like. So there are times when the angels would say that the previous session was actually co-opted by demons, and there was a lot of back and forth between Dee and Kelley as to whether they were communicating with evil entities who were trying to obstruct this communication, or whether or not it was a test, or whether or not it was just a case of them getting it wrong, that the communication becoming garbled. As I hope I'm stressing, Dee himself was too analytical to do it himself. He was very much into alphanumeric puzzles, he would, and codes and so on, and he felt that his academic mind was an obstruction to getting in touch with these forces, which is why Kelley was able to do so, because Kelley didn't have these talents in these areas. So DuQuette describes these early stages of Magick, and I'll come back to why he does so, but he says that there are three, and it was the Heptarchia Mystica, the Loget, and Enochian. Now, what I mean by him having to go back on this, DuQuette says that he used to always follow the Enochian rule, which was don't try to replicate the magic Dee and Kelley received. Instead, just use the system that they received. And DuQuette says that he followed that rule for a long time, but gradually he began to think, well, if you were a great sports star, for example, you wouldn't just go out into an arena and perform. You would practice, and through that practice you'd be better able to perform when the event occurred. So he began to see that the Enochian system was the event, and these earlier systems were the practice. So he talks about how he began to change his mind, and he gives his reasons, and then he talks about the systems and the artifacts, not artifacts, that's the wrong word, the instruments that Kelley and Dee were told to create in order to facilitate the communication. So DuQuette goes on to explain how Dee was very influenced by a particular grimoire called the Book of Soiga, and it itself was very similar, much more simplistic template for what Dee and Kelley would create themselves later on, but it was alphanumeric, and it was coded, and you could use certain ways to discover names and calls. Now, do you need the instruments, or sorry, the pieces of equipment that DuQuette goes on to describe? Well, DuQuette feels that you certainly need to have them internalized. So it's very interesting to read about them and how to, like, he gives full instructions on how to make them and so on. And he talks about how these tablets will contain the names of angels, celestial beings, the calls to unlock these realms, and that comes to the fore with the creation of the holy table. It's this touching point, I suppose, a place where heaven and earth meet, as DuQuette says himself. And this turns up in all kinds of magical systems. Just read a line from the new book by Thomas Sheridan, Sorcery, and he talks about, where's the line again? An abyss of unseen gods and forces performing the task of middlemen between that of the will and the intended outcome. I thought that was a line that echoed pretty much what the function of the Holy Table from DuQuette's perspective anyway. Why these calls put you in touch with these rulers of particular areas is because in DuQuette's view it's basically a shamanic system. Now, it doesn't sound like a shamanic system when you're using such biblical language. For DuQuette, each call will induce a trance, and there's no kind of difference between African shamanism for DuQuette and the Enochian system in result, but obviously there are different routes to get to the same place. And there's a point where Enochian magic is called spiritual forces expressed as units of living consciousness, and that's very similar to a Mongolian description of shamanism, where it says it's shamanism, you get in touch with transcendent frequencies of consciousness. So for Dee and Kelley, their whole outlook was completely shaped by the Bible. And this is really important because it means that for someone doing Enochian magic today, they're not going to have the same biblical perspective as Kelley and Dee, even if they believe the Bible is true, literally. They're still going to have these the kind of knowledge that Dee, and the opposing viewpoints, of course, that Dee and Kelley didn't have to deal with in their own day. And for me, there's kind of a problem there as well, because it seems like the angels themselves have the same outlook as Dee and Kelley, and they don't have much more knowledge than them. Now, there's another aspect to this which is very, very peculiar, and it's that the angels believed that Dee and Kelley were one person. They believed that they were communicating only with one entity. And they talk about this, DuQuette talks about this in the book in a bit more detail, but it made me wonder about the perspective of these forces then. Is there something that they can't understand as well? And it kind of makes you go back then to the earlier exchanges where various angels were contradicting each other, saying the person, the energy form you were communicating with earlier wasn't was evil and didn't have your best interests at heart. It was deceiving you, and yet even the most intelligent and knowledgeable angels seem to have this skewed perspective of what they were dealing with as well. Connected to that slightly is the angels' literal belief in the Bible as well, and they have a perspective. At one point, an angel says to Dee that the magic that Dee is receiving was originally given to Enoch, and it was passed down through a few different generations until men became so wicked that God decided that they didn't deserve to have it anymore, and it became lost. And the angel says that in order to receive the magic, Enoch went through the same system and made the same instruments that Dee gets the instructions to make. So the angels themselves have quite a limited viewpoint, it would seem to me, as someone who does not believe in the literal truth of the Bible. So DuQuette really talks about how a lot of the Golden Dawn rituals, as I've mentioned, were guessed at really because they didn't have, even today, a lot of the Enochian magic seems to be based on ceremonies that people come to themselves, because there seems to be quite a lot of missing information. Certainly Dee and Kelley didn't write down a lot of instructions as to what people should do, and this is what DuQuette talks about, especially towards the end of the book, when he goes into the practice element of it, how to have visions, the calls, and so on. I suppose an important part of the book for those coming to this for the first time is, like, what proof is there, if any, that this is actually real? Is it a real event? Because Edward Kelley himself was a con man, but the elaborateness of the system and how it was received is staggering. Now, that doesn't mean that it's, you can't say that means it's authentic, but DuQuette talks about what he thinks is the ultimate proof, which was when the sigils were received, these 7 dots appeared on the board, and when he connected them up, he would get a kind of a character to symbolize each particular energy form, if you like, or ruler. And then when that was overlaid upon the table, the names were actually spelled out correctly. Now, that's a very, very simple explanation, and when you read the book, DuQuette goes into it in more detail, and he kind of explains it much better than I'm doing here. Another important distinction that DuQuette makes is that people need to stop thinking that there are different universes when they're conducting magic. So he says, like, whether you're doing Solomonic magic, Kabbalistic magic, Enochian magic, you're getting in touch, according to him, with the same universe, but you're just looking at it from a different perspective. So I would believe that myself. The last section then of the book is to do with the calls. There are lots of examples of ceremonies. There are also accounts of what people saw and what people heard and messages that they received. So, Enochian Vision Magic, an introduction and practical guide to the magic of Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelley by Lon Milo DuQuette, is a very interesting book. For me, it solidified some things that I would have previously thought. It also raised some questions, and I don't think I'll be a ceremonial magician in the context of DuQuette's perspective. I don't think I have that kind of mind. I don't think I have that kind of structure, to be honest. But it's something that it's a very accessible book if you want to go that way. If you want to learn about Enochian magic, it's not a biography of Dee really, but it is a breakdown of what happened to him and Kelley, and it's very detailed in how the methodology was applied. So if that appeals to you, I would recommend this book highly. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.